Archbishop Antje Jackelen, Lutheran bishop, head of Church of Sweden. I've had the privilege of knowing you now for over a decade, and as I said to you earlier, it brings a great smile to my heart to see you, and I could see that it's reciprocal. Regrettable circumstances, but it's a joy to see you under these circumstances nonetheless.
Good to see you as well.
Yeah, exactly. Where's coronavirus finding you? What are the challenges, the particularities, the opportunities that come your way as a head of a nationwide church?
I think the main issue is about anxiety and uncertainty when it comes to Sweden. We are a stable society, have been so for a long time, so we are not actually used to being in a crisis like this. We have heard about and seen about other people's crises, but people who are living in Sweden now, except for the immigrants, have no experience of such a crisis. And that makes people, I think, giving people different strategies to cope with their anxieties and their unrest in this. But generally speaking, people are adapting quite quickly. Everyone is getting digital at a higher pace than we might have expected. We have lots and lots of digital meetings. People even have their social life on the internet. So a lot of that is happening.
So your main challenges are pastoral, calming people, guiding them through their anxiety. So that leads to the next question, which is, so what do you offer people by way of spiritual nourishment when they face fear, anxiety, even panic?
The main challenge for the church is, on the one hand, to adapt our work to the restrictions that are in place. Like we are not allowed to gather more than 50 people at a spot. And of course, we are advised all this keeping a distance, social distancing and all this. So our congregations are very busy in finding creative ways of not just shutting down things, but rather to adapt them. That's been our slogan. We don't shut down, we adapt and we change and we transform. And that applies to our service life, but that also applies to the diaconal, the social work of the church. And that actually has expanded very much so. We have an agreement with other major actors in civil society and state authorities that the church in many places will coordinate the social work that in the first place helps elderly people with getting food and getting their medicines and so on. So our diaconal work is actually expanding, whereas our worship work is sort of a little bit decreasing since we cannot gather people, more than 50 people at a place. And in some places, the situation is so bad that we actually have put official public worship services on hold, which is quite painful since it's the time of Easter in the Christian church. Apart from that, the Church of Sweden is actually the biggest membership organization in Swedish society as a whole. We have like 59% of the Swedish population is members of the Church of Sweden, which also implies that we are in constant contact with the government, with ministers, with the authorities, in order to monitor the situation and to think about best practices, not least when it comes to funerals.
Okay. So it's a case of adapting. Let me zoom in on this term adapting. Does adapting mean loss, compromise, rediscovery, act of faith? Tell us more about this notion of adapting, because all religious communities worldwide have to adapt, but you're the first person to use that term as part of a slogan, as a theory. What can you say about adapting as something that other people can see something as something with potential, something positive.
Yeah, well, I think in a crisis, I think it's not just something you say lightly. Every crisis is also a possibility. It is actually a possibility, and it is a possibility to pick and choose ways that are like in the long run very negative, and to choose ways which are more positive. And of course the wisdom is to know which is what, and also wanting to act. It's interesting, our Lent, the period of Lent before Easter, our Lenten action, that is the church asking people to give money for international work. It had a slogan this year, which would be translated into English: "Stay on the side of courage." And I think that slogan fits very well the current situation.
What does that mean?
I mean, if you have to adapt to very difficult situations where you don't see the end of it, really, that demands of you some courage to say, well, for instance, for the church to say, no, we are not just closing down. We're trying to find ways to preach the gospel in words and in actions in the way we can do right now. And I see a lot of creativity in congregations. In one place, they have put devotions on a USB stick and delivered to the senior care facility in their place to be used as they like. Of course, a lot of congregations are live streaming their services. One congregation launched a drive-in service, and actually so many people came that they had to double it. So it is like seeing the opportunities. In one congregation, they have done a movie with baby rhythmics. So instead of the parents and the babies gathering in the parish house, they can at least watch it in their homes and do these rhythmic things together, but in isolation. And I think that means a lot for the spiritual and mental health of people.
Tell me about courage. Courage requires resources, spiritual resources. So what are your spiritual and faith resources that allow people to cultivate courage and to overcome fear?
I think we of course need to cultivate spiritual resilience. And the more of that you have cultivated before the crisis, the better off. But sometimes the crisis just also empowers and creates an enormous growth all of a sudden. And I think that some people really thrive, whereas others are so afraid and fearful and insecure that they project their fear on others, on the leaders, and vote for a more restrictive attitude. So I think it poses the question also how much it poses the question to us as, so to speak, religious professionals. How important do we actually think that these practices, the teaching, the words, the actions are? So if we do not lightly say, no, we stop doing all these things while the shops are still open. You can still go to the barber shop, but should we stop baptizing people because we touch them when we baptize? I mean, it puts a lot of questions of what is really what we mean when we do these things. And I think that is very healthy because it makes us think afresh about our theology.
But then it sounds like it potentially casts doubt on the value of our teaching and practices and prayer rather than so potentially undermining them. But we're back to the question. So how do we cultivate courage? How do we cultivate resilience? What are the tools for doing that both for the clergy and for the laity?
I think one essential thing is dealing with our own anxiety and worries in this. And there are at least two ways of doing it that are extreme in a way, and which I wouldn't recommend. And the one is that confront it totally and all at the same time in order to defeat it. That's like if you have suffered a loss and you say, now I grieve 3 weeks or 3 days or 3 months, and then it's all over. It doesn't work. And the other extreme would be, let's get distracted. Let's try to forget about it. And that's not going to work either. That makes, if you compare to grief, that makes for a very unhealthy way of grieving. So I think the way to do it is to try to find ways in and out of what is so difficult, and to have it, to go in it, but also go out of it, and to enjoy the islands of normalcy that you can build in the midst of chaos. Because very often there are small islands of normalcy that you can discover in the middle of chaos, and enjoy those, and don't feel guilty about having fun in the midst of that which is difficult, because the difficult things are still there and you will go into them again, but then you will have a positive experience with you. I think that is why prayers often are not just Kyrie eleison. It's also gratitude. It's praise of God, even in the midst of the worst things. I mean, if you look at the Psalms, it's this mixture of it. I think that's spiritual wisdom.
Beautiful. In fact, we had Archbishop Justin Welby, with us, and he also was talking about the variety and the range of prayer as part of the tool. So you're very much on the same page. As a rabbi, so you're celebrating Holy Week. You'll be celebrating Easter. You have your whole faith story: death, darkness, resurrection, light. How does this fundamental faith story empower you with that courage and resilience, or does that not really play out? Is Sweden such a secularized society that the spiritual medicine is more generic, or does the particularity of your faith play out in helping people overcome the fear?
That's an excellent question. On the surface, Sweden is indeed very secularized, but it is on the surface. If you scratch the surface a little bit, there is a hunger and a thirst for these things, especially now. I'm in so many radio and TV programs, so many interviews. They want to do this like person portrait in newspapers, but what they're asking is, how should we think about this? What about anxiety? What about hope? So the questions are there, and I have a sense that the answers that we can offer that are grounded in our faith tradition, but they may not be expressed with the theological or exclusive language. They may be posed in a more general language, but they are wanted, they're understood, and they are many times experienced as helpful. Like the question, what are we doing with our anxiety? How can we use this time for reflection? And what can we learn from this? And I mean, if you address these questions...
But that means that you, as the Archbishop, can't just preach the gospel openly. You have to, not that it's forbidden, but culturally, the receptivity will be greater if you translate it to a more neutral medium.
Yeah, if you bring it together in ways that gives people clues. Let me give you an example for a reflection. I mean, people have asked us, when is this over? Give us a date. When will it switch? When has it peaked? How can we know? Give us some information, then we'll do better. And that is exactly like where we are on the Saturday before Easter Day. Mm. Jesus is dead. Everything has gone quite wrong. the disciples, they are isolated, they're living in isolation, they don't know anything about the future, and they're terribly afraid, and they have reasons to be afraid. So it's really where does this going? And then in the morning of Easter Day, the big stone is rolled away, the grave is open, and they meet the resurrected Jesus. And I think you can tell this story, and you can see the connections between our situation and between the situation then. And even, Jesus had this crown of thorns and corona, right? So, there's something that can connect even with people who don't know the whole story.
Okay. I'm not sure we want people to think of Jesus as Corona, but I suppose that's part of interreligious debate over the centuries.
Well, it's not saying that Jesus died of Corona, right? But it's saying that Jesus knew what suffering is. Yeah, it's the suffering in it, the suffering piece.
So you said earlier, you alluded to the reality of people having to be in seclusion and isolation and distance and not knowing how to use it. So what are the spiritual lessons? Obviously, psychologists have lots of columns and prime time on TV to discuss how to use their time in isolation and to get on Zoom and talk to people, etc. But what is the spiritual teaching for being in isolation and solitude, especially for people who are not used to it?
I think it is acknowledging that a forced time for reflection can be quite exhausting, quite demanding, and growing into wisdom is not always a pleasant thing. So also to be patient with our restlessness, with this different kind of stress what we are experiencing. Some people these days have got more to do than ever before, and there's so much pressure on some people, and other people their life has come to a stop. So these are different kinds of stresses, and of course also this can be a stress on families. On the one hand, it can be lovely to have more time for each other, but it can also be a task that people are not up to. We also know that especially for women and children who don't have a safe home, this is a very difficult time with threats and even worse than so, with violence.
Other than acknowledging, anything that can be done about that?
Well, I think even on spiritual grounds, you would affirm some of the things that even psychologists would say. Try to find a structure. Try to find goals for what you want to accomplish. Try to have your frustration and your anxiety and all of that transformed into love and care, because that's the best thing that can happen. If all those negative energies that are quite natural that they emerge, but if they can be transformed into love and care, wow, what a movement.
How does one transform anxiety and frustration into love and care? If you do that, you'll get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, I think we are all fragile human beings who fall behind on our ideals. But I think prayer is a powerful way of doing things, because in prayer we can be relieved both from our failures and gather new courage and afresh do these things. Prayer also will widen our horizons. In Europe, we have seen that the crisis not necessarily increases solidarity between countries, so that we spiritual traditions always want you to see more than yourself, your loved ones, your town, your city, your country, your continent. It impels you to really look for the most vulnerable, look after the most vulnerable, and also acknowledge that the crisis that we experience is something different than the crisis that you will have in countries where you don't have even soap, and unless this disinfection. Yeah, right. So the global solidarity, and I think also asking the question. Spiritual traditions also impel you to ask the question. How do we want to come out of this crisis, on the other side of this crisis? An important question to ask, I think, is, wow, if this crisis has made it possible to make such radical changes to our lives individually and as societies, as a global population, what does it mean for how we will face the climate crisis?
Yeah.
In the best case scenario, we bring out some very powerful learnings that can be transmitted into fighting the climate crisis. If a small virus can do all this, the climate crisis should do so much more.
So what did I hear you saying? Because you moved from the notion, and all these were questions that I was hoping we could actually touch. So I'm grateful to you for bringing them in. I heard you saying we were dealing with the question of frustration and transforming it, and even the potential of dealing with domestic violence due to frustration. You moved from there to broader solidarity and a vision of the future. So was all that tied together through prayer? Was your suggestion that the means of establishing solidarity and drawing the lessons requires of us to cultivate a practice of prayer, because that's what we need in order to both horizontally reach out to others in solidarities and to project ourselves into a better future? Was that the message?
Well, it wouldn't be right to say that you absolutely need a specific form of prayer to get all this. Obviously, there are people of no faith who say, I don't pray, and they can achieve all of this as well. Then you can always discuss what is prayer in this, because then they may tell you, but I don't pray, but I meditate, all these things. But I do mean that the practice of prayer actually is a powerful way of helping you to get a more proper sense of proportions, because it widens your perspective. And that's often what happens when you go to a worship service. You may go in there and think, oh gosh, this is really heavy, and don't care about this. And when you come out, it may be the other way around. That this is, after all, not so serious, but I should really care about this. So at getting your proportions adjusted, I think that is an important part of a spiritual life.
That's really the heart of the spiritual life, and it sounds like the various issues that we had earmarked for sharing all gravitate around this transformative power of prayer.
I think so. And it's of course about, because the transformative power of prayer will also be transformative for your way of living. I just have this on my desk, a bishop's letter on the climate. This is what the bishops of the Church of Sweden issued. Well, it came in English just some weeks ago, and it goes back to something we wrote already 5 years ago. Already then we said the climate crisis at heart is a spiritual crisis. And 5 years ago, not so many people were saying that. More people are saying this today, and the conclusion from that is that the climate crisis is not a crisis to be solved by science or technology alone, by politicians alone. by the corporate sector alone? No, it requires also culture and spirituality, because everything that is an expression of human dignity must work together in this. And I think the same can be applied to the corona crisis. Everything that is an expression of human dignity must work together in this. And I find this quite hopeful also for Sweden, that the government in these days is acknowledging and telling the faith communities. Actually, the Prime Minister said this the other day to representatives of the churches and also other faith communities. There were Jews, Muslims, and Buddhists, and said, what you are doing and the fact that you are not closing down but adapting to this is in itself a sign of hope. And we really, really appreciate what you are doing. We are not hearing that when everything is well. But now we are hearing that. And I think there is a sense of, well, we cannot do without this.
So it sounds to me like your greatest hope of how we can come away from this crisis is having earned the respects, the habits of mind, and the vision that would allow us to move to the next big challenge, or to the previously existing challenge, possibly interrelated challenge of climate change.
Well, part of it, yes, because climate change is not going away just because we are occupied by the corona crisis. That's for sure. I think that is part of it, but not the whole thing. I think what is guiding me is that the church, in my case, should carry hope, should be a voice of prayer and intercession, and it should also be able to harbor the anxiety and the grief and all that which there is, and it should provide the inspiration for good moral action to implement the love command, so to say.
I wish you in your leadership role the greatest success in the, I would say, threefold strategy of prayer, overcoming fear, and giving moral guidance. These are important aspects of what a religious tradition can give in this world. Maybe we take a few moments to talk about some of your particular gifts, because before you were bishop, you were theologian, and theologian is something. It's not something we do; it's something we are, and therefore I know you maintain your theological interests. And as you shared with me before the interview, actually, this corona situation is driving you to some fresh theological reflection. Could you share some of the core issues and maybe potential insights that this corona situation brings up in you as a theological thinker and as part of your own leadership role?
Well, that's a huge question.
Take your time.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking it. I think the corona crisis maybe doesn't confront us with new questions, but the questions that already were there appear in a new light and with new, for instance, people asking, but is this creation really good? Does God care? Some people even ask, is the virus a punishment from God? And how do we speak about evil? And what really is a human being? How powerful, how weak are we? What to say of our mortality and vulnerability? And what actually can we hope for? And I think the question of hope is actually a question that is underlying most of the challenges we are facing as humanity these days. I mean, climate crisis makes it important for us to have an answer to the question, what can we really hope for? But it's also global migration, and it also will apply to digitalization. that will, by the way, takes huge steps forward now, but it will, as we know, cause some revolution in how we look upon work and who will have work and all those kinds of things. So the question hope is going to stay with us also beyond the corona crisis.
Okay, so what it sounds like is that corona is forcing people, or opportunities for people who usually rush through life, to stop and think. And all the big questions emerge as a consequence of it. And you as a teacher have the opportunity now to address all the big questions, even though they may not be exclusive, but now they're coming to the front. So what are some of the insights or teachings that you see emerging from your own struggles and reflections on these questions?
When it comes to evil, for instance, I mean, in classic theology, we neatly distinguish between natural evil and moral evil. Natural evil being that which we have no responsibility for. That's the eruption of volcanoes and earthquakes and so on. And moral evil, of course, being more or less sin, both personal sin but also structural sin accomplished by human beings. But as we see now, they are much more intertwined. Like we already saw that with the tsunami, when 2006?
2005.
2005, yes. I mean, the earthquake was an earthquake. No human being, as we know, is responsible for it. But the consequences of the tsunami itself, they were worsened in some cases by unwise stewardship of the earth. And we see that also, of course, with the climate changes as well, that things are actually intertwined with how we as humanity deal with the resources of this planet. And I think that is an important insight that philosophically and theologically it makes some sense to differentiate between those, but when it comes to our existential conditions of life, they sort of are intertwined with each other, and that gives us more insight in how we should deal with structural evil and personal sin. And for instance, it helps us not to get stuck with just personal sins, but see the brighter scope of that and bring that before God as well. The question about, is creation good? And I think also the coming into existence of a virus and the changes both in bacteria. I mean, we still have multi-resistant bacteria as a problem also there.
What resistant bacteria?
Multi-resistant
bacteria.
Multi-resistant bacteria that can be very dangerous to humanity as well. Of course, it's a part of evolution. So what did God think about using evolution as a means of creation? And I think we can learn from when we as theologians look at complexity research and emergence, that much seems to point to the fact that like disorder and even catastrophes are a means of complexification and creation, so that it takes disturbances and what we would look as catastrophes in order to bring forth consciousness, love, free will, and all these things that we usually enjoy quite a lot. So that gives a broader perspective to the question: is this good or is it evil?
In other words, if I say it in the Jewish language, the Kabbalists affirm there's a polarity between justice and mercy, between love and harshness that's fundamental to creation. And there's an affirmation that the foundation of all is love, but all it passes through judgments, limits, constrictions. And what you're saying is that the theological challenge and lesson is to see the emergence of a higher design that's informed by love, even through catastrophe.
that is at least part of it, yes.
Okay, and the other part of it we'll have to read in the book that comes out.
Well,
maybe we should conclude with a prayer. You've spoken about the centrality of prayer. Let's put that into practice. Maybe you can share with us a prayer for this particular time and all its multiple dimensions, both the liturgical cycle and what the world is facing.
Yeah. God, in the midst of a crisis that is shaking all your humanity, we ask your mercy. We pray for those who are afflicted, for those who are dying, for those who have left their life on earth, for all those who are caring, for those who are in positions of decision making decisions without knowing all the consequences. We ask for courage, for wisdom, and we give you thanks for all the good that is happening, the hearts that are touched by love, the community and fellowship that is nourished in this time of crisis, for people getting together in order to protect the vulnerable, for all those who show solidarity. And as we in the Church are about to celebrate Easter, to walk with Jesus to Gethsemane, Golgotha, and eagerly waiting Easter morning, and the heavy stone at the tomb rolled away, and new life coming forth. We ask that Jesus might walk in the midst of those who are anxious, in isolation, and that they all may be touched by the greeting of peace. Oh God, you're always greater than our images of you. You're always greater than our thoughts, always greater than the best we can do and the worst we can do. But in you we trust. And therefore we say, God, have mercy. Amen.